The man hadn't said a word in 20 minutes. He sat in a lawn chair near the edge of the patio, holding a paper plate with a half-eaten hot dog, watching the flags ripple on the neighbours' porches. Nobody had introduced him. Nobody had thought to. He was just the old man who came with the Hendersons. Quiet. Polite. The kind of man whose presence you register the way you register furniture. Then the loudmouth said, "I held a sector at Khe Sanh for 63 days. You want to talk about real war, I'm the man to talk to." The old man set down his plate. He didn't stand up. He just looked at the man across the picnic table with eyes that had seen something that Look had never even dreamed of. "Which sector?" he said. "If you believe every veteran deserves to be heard, type honour in the comments." His name was Raymond Kowalski, and he had been old for a long time. Not the kind of old that happens slowly, the kind that creeps up year by year and leaves a man surprised when he looks in the mirror. Raymond had been made old in a specific week in January of 1968, on a ridgeline in Quang Tri Province where the red clay was so wet it swallowed boots whole, and the fog sat so thick you could reach into it and feel it move against your palm like breath. He had been 24 years old then. He had been old ever since. He was 79 now. He wore khaki trousers and a plain white short-sleeved button-down, and the shirt sat loose on a frame that had once carried 65 pounds of reconnaissance gear through triple canopy jungle without breaking stride. That frame still carried itself well. Military bearing doesn't leave a man the way muscle does. It lives in the spine, in the set of the shoulders, in the way the chin levels unconsciously whenever the body feels uncertain. Raymond Kowalski crossed a 4th of July barbecue the way he had once crossed a firebase perimeter, noting exits, reading faces, cataloguing the space around him before he committed to any part of it. He walked with a cane now, a dark wooden thing with a brass ferrule that tapped against concrete and went silent on grass. His right knee had been rebuilt twice, the first time in a military hospital in Japan in 1969, and again at the VA in Milwaukee in 2003, and it still gave out in cold weather or when he stood too long in one place. He didn't apologise for the cane. He didn't acknowledge it. It was simply part of how he moved through the world now, the way the stars were simply part of how the night looked. His face was deeply lined, the kind of face that maps its life without meaning to. Creases at the eyes from decades of squinting into sun and distance. A long-heeled crescent scar along the jaw that he'd stopped explaining sometime in the 1980s, and a stillness in the features that people sometimes mistook for vacancy and only recognised as control when it was too late to take back what they'd said. He'd driven down from Menominee Falls that morning with his daughter Carol and her husband Dave Henderson, because Carol had asked him to come and Raymond didn't have a good reason not to. He liked Carol's neighbourhood well enough. He liked the smell of charcoal. He liked that nobody here knew anything about him, which meant nobody would try to talk to him about Vietnam in the careful, reverent way that made him feel like a museum exhibit. So he sat. He ate his hot dog. He watched the flags. He was good at waiting. He had spent the better part of 2 years doing it in places where waiting kept you alive. He noticed the man by the grill almost immediately, not because there was anything alarming about him, but because Raymond noticed everything, and the man was loud. Not raising his voice loud, but the kind of loud that spreads through a party the way smoke spreads through a room. You don't see it arrive, you just find it everywhere. The man was maybe 55, broad across the shoulders with the soft belly that comes after the muscle leaves, wearing a Semper Fi t-shirt that had been washed enough times that the print was starting to ghost. He had large hands and a large laugh, and he held his beer can the way men hold things they want other people to see them holding. His name, Raymond would later learn, was Gary Polkow. He sold insurance in Waukesha. He had been the loudest person at every party he'd ever attended, and what Raymond Kowalski did not yet know, sitting in his lawn chair watching the flags working through his hot dog, was that in approximately 30 minutes, Gary Polkow would say something that would make Raymond set down his plate. And after that, nothing about this barbecue would be the same. The Henderson backyard on Millbrook Avenue was the kind of yard that worked hard on holidays. Carol had strung lights along the fence line even though it was barely past noon and wouldn't get dark for another 8 hours. There were 2 folding tables covered in red-checked plastic tablecloths, weighted down at the corners with small American flag centerpieces that rattled in the occasional July breeze. A hand-painted banner reading Happy 4th hung between the garage door and the maple tree, slightly crooked on the left side where the tape had given way once already and been restuck, Somewhere behind the garage, Dave was running an extension cord to a portable Bluetooth speaker that was cycling through a playlist of classic rock with the occasional patriotic song dropped in like punctuation. There were maybe 30 people spread across the yard, which was plenty for the space and just too many to introduce everyone. They arrived in the way backyard parties always arrive, in small clusters, couples first, then groups of neighbours who knew each other well enough to merge without formality, then the outliers who came alone or with one other person, and stood near the food table until someone talked to them. Kids cut between adults' legs with the territorial confidence of animals who know they're allowed to be anywhere. A beagle named Winston had already stolen 2 hot dogs and was being pursued with half-hearted disappointment by a 10-year-old in a paper flag hat. Raymond was one of the outliers. Carol had placed him near the patio door with a lawn chair and a plate, and had introduced him to the 2 couples nearest him, the Marchettis and the Flemings, and then had been absorbed into the party the way hostesses always are, in increments, each increment temporary, until suddenly she was across the yard discussing something about a school board with 2 women Raymond had never seen before. He didn't mind. Ed Marchetti had worked 30 years for the post office and had opinions about everything, which Raymond found easier to navigate than people who had none. He could nod to opinions. He'd spent a lifetime nodding. Gary Polkow was holding court near the grill. He had assembled around him a small audience of 3 men and a woman, the way certain people assemble audiences without seeming to try, through sheer velocity of speech and the implication that whatever they're saying is more interesting than whatever you were doing before. He was telling a story that involved gestures, a lot of them, the kind that indicated scale and chaos and things exploding. And the audience was leaning in the way audiences lean when they're not sure if they believe something but they want to. Raymond caught fragments across the yard. 6 weeks, just us and the hill, and incoming every night. You couldn't even, and I don't talk about it normally, but today of all days. He noted the Semper Fi shirt. He noted the cadence of the story, which had the rhythm of something told many times, smoothed down by repetition until it felt like a fact. He went back to his hot dog, but something in him, some old calibration that had never fully switched off, had begun to tick. Ed Marchetti said something about the Cubs. Raymond answered. He kept one part of his attention on the conversation in front of him, and another part, quieter and older, on the man by the grill, because something in the story didn't fit. He couldn't place it yet. Just a wrong note, like a word in the wrong language dropped into a sentence that was otherwise correct. The brain catalogues these things before the conscious mind gets to them, and Raymond's brain had been doing this kind of work since before Gary Polkow was born. He waited. He was extraordinarily good at that. And then Gary Polkow said the word Khe Sanh, and Raymond's paper plate stopped moving toward his mouth. He set it down slowly on his knee. He looked at Ed Marchetti and said politely, "Excuse me," and he stood up with his cane and walked across the yard. What nobody at that barbecue could have anticipated was what Raymond Kowalski was going to do when he got there. He didn't walk fast. There was no urgency in him, no visible change in his bearing beyond the slight purposefulness of a man who has somewhere specific to be. He crossed the yard at the pace of a man who has crossed many yards, many fields, many ridgelines, always at the pace that the situation required and never faster. Gary was in the middle of a sentence when Raymond arrived at the edge of the circle, because at that point the NVA had us completely surrounded, 3 divisions, something like 40,000 troops around a base we had about 6,000 Marines trying to hold. 5,800 Marines, Raymond said. He said it the way you correct a math error. Pleasantly, informatively, not looking for a fight, just noting that the number was wrong. The circle opened for him the way circles open when an older person approaches, automatically, without discussion. Gary looked at him. Raymond looked at Gary. There was a moment where the 2 of them were simply measuring each other, the way men do, the kind of measuring that has nothing to do with height or weight, and everything to do with something older and harder to name. "I'm Raymond," he said, "Carol's father. Gary." The handshake was firm, the kind of handshake Gary had probably been told was important. "Gary Polkow." "You were talking about Khe Sanh," Raymond said. "I was." Gary's chin came up slightly. Not defensive, not yet, but aware. "Served there, 68. Marine? Force Recon." Raymond nodded slowly. He did not look at Gary the way a man looks when he's about to call someone a liar. He looked at him the way a man looks when he's about to ask a question he already knows the answer to. "Which sector?" he said. Gary smiled. It was a practiced smile. the smile of a man who has told stories at parties for decades. This many years later, you want me to remember sectors? I remember mine, Raymond said simply. One of the men in the circle, a younger one, maybe 35, standing with a beer and the careful attentiveness of someone who senses something worth paying attention to, shifted his weight. The woman next to him touched her husband's arm without looking at him. Gary's smile held. Perimeter defence, north side of the base, rotated positions. Raymond looked at him. North perimeter. That's right. What unit? 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. Raymond was quiet for a moment. He looked out across the yard, at the flag banner rattling between the garage and the maple, at the kids, at Winston the beagle being scolded with a paper plate. Then he looked back at Gary. "How was the red clay?" he said. Gary blinked. "How was it?" "After the monsoon, before it dried out. That particular red clay they had up in Quang Tri province." Raymond kept his voice even, curious, the tone of a man sharing a memory. "Most people who were there remember the smell. I'm curious if it hit you the same way it hit me." Something shifted behind Gary's eyes. Not panic, not yet. Just the slight adjustment of a man who's been asked to produce a detail his story doesn't include. "It was mud," Gary said. "It was red mud. You know how mud smells." "I do," Raymond said. "Yes." He nodded again, slowly, looking down at the grass near his cane. "Tell me about the hills," he said. The small crowd had shifted its composition without anyone quite deciding to do so. Ed Marchetti had drifted over from the patio. Dave Henderson, who had been at the grill, had handed the tongs to someone else and was standing a little apart watching. 2 women who had been talking near the coolers had gone quiet. The beagle, Winston, had settled himself between 2 lawn chairs and was watching with the undiscriminating attentiveness of animals in the presence of human tension. Gary Polkow still held his beer. He hadn't taken a drink in the last 2 minutes. "The hills," Raymond repeated mildly. "The firebase was surrounded by them. Marines fought for control of several of them during the siege. Some of them were costly." He let a beat pass. "Hill 881. "Heavy fighting there," Gary said. Not a lie, exactly. It was a fact, available to anyone who'd read a book. But the way he said it had changed. The ease had left it. There was effort in the sentence now. "North or south?" Raymond asked. "What?" 881 North and 881 South were both contested. Which one are you talking about?" Gary's jaw tightened slightly. "I wasn't at the hills specifically. I was on the perimeter." "Of course," Raymond said. He nodded as if this were completely reasonable. "How about Hill 950 or Hill 1015? You would have been able to see them from your position." "You could see a lot of hills." "You could," Raymond agreed. "Although from the north perimeter, 950 would have been mostly obscured by elevation. You'd have had a clear line on 558 on a clear day, but not much further than that." He paused. "Was there a lot of fog when you were there?" Gary looked at him for a long moment. The ease was fully gone now. What replaced it was something harder and more careful. "A lot of fog," he confirmed. "There was," Raymond said. He wasn't agreeing with Gary. He was agreeing with himself about something else entirely. "Thick enough some mornings you couldn't see the wire." He looked up at Gary with a conversational pleasantness that had something under it, the way a river has something under the surface that you can only feel once you're already in it. "Tell me about the rocket attacks." Someone in the circle made a quiet sound. Not a word, just the intake of breath that comes before a word that doesn't arrive. Gary said, "There were rocket attacks, obviously. We were under siege." "What kind of rockets?" "Russian-made. NVA equipment." "True," Raymond said. "Specifically, 122mm rockets. They came in at a particular angle, depending on the launch position. The ones from Korok Mountain had a specific signature. You could almost tell them apart by sound after a while, if you'd been there long enough." He tilted his head. "Did you develop an ear for them?" Gary Polkow set his beer down on the folding table next to him. He set it down very carefully, as if placing it incorrectly might break something. "I don't know what you're looking for," he said. His voice had a new quality now, controlled, but with pressure behind the control. "Every soldier processed that experience differently. I don't carry it around the way you apparently do." "I'm not a soldier," Raymond said pleasantly. "I was Special Forces. There's a difference, though I'm not holding that against you." He smiled, just barely. "And I'm not looking for anything. I'm just curious about your experience. It was the most significant military siege on American soil, on American positions, since Dien Bien Phu." I think about it often. I like to hear how other people remember it." Ed Marchetti, standing behind Raymond's left shoulder, looked at Dave Henderson. Dave was watching his father-in-law with an expression that might have been alarm and might have been something else. Carol had appeared at the edge of the gathering now, drawn by the quiet the way people are drawn by the quiet that descends on a conversation that has become something more than a conversation. She knew that look on her father's face. She'd seen it exactly twice before in her life. Both times had been memorable. Raymond Kowalski was not done, and Gary Polkow, for the first time in possibly decades, had nowhere to go. What nobody in that backyard understood yet, not Carol, not Dave, not the 35-year-old with the beer, not even Gary, was why Raymond had walked over here in the first place. It wasn't anger. Raymond Kowalski hadn't been angry in a very long time. It was something else, something quieter and harder and older than anger, something that had been waiting, patient as red clay drying in the sun for exactly this moment. There was a photograph Raymond had carried in his wallet for 56 years. Not a photograph of a landscape or a landmark, not something scenic. It was a photograph of 8 men standing in front of a sandbagged structure with no roof, squinting into white morning light, their gear so familiar to them by that point that they wore it the way civilians wear watches, not noticing it anymore, just part of how the body looked. 4 of those men were dead within the following 6 weeks. Raymond knew which 4. He'd known for 56 years, the way you know the multiplication tables, the way you know your own name, without effort, without trying, without the mercy of forgetting. He did not think of that photograph as a sad thing. He thought of it as a true thing, which is different. He had been assigned to MACV-SOG in late 1967, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, which was the military's way of naming something without naming it. He ran long-range reconnaissance patrols in the hill country northwest of Khe Sanh Combat Base during some of the siege's most concentrated months, operating in the kind of silence and isolation that made the base, with its mortars and its fire missions and its 6,000 Marine, seem, by contrast, almost loud. His team of 6 moved through terrain that wasn't on the maps they were given, reported on NVA troop concentrations and supply routes, and avoided contact with the zealotry of men who understood that contact, for them, meant the end of the mission, and very possibly the end of themselves. He had never talked about this at parties. He had barely talked about it at all. What Raymond knew about Khe Sanh, he knew the way a surgeon knows the body, not from books, not from accounts, not from the careful reconstruction of memory shaped by decades of telling. He knew it because he had been there, in the literal soil of it, in the specific temperature of it in January when the mist came off the hills and the temperature dropped far enough that your breath was visible and the red clay in the foxholes went from mud to something almost solid. He knew what the 122mm rockets sounded like, incoming from Company Rock versus the 130mm artillery fired from the northern hills. He knew the smell of the base after a direct hit on the ammunition dump, a smell so specific and so enormous that it had its own weight, its own texture, its own permanent address in the memory. He also knew, with the same specificity, what someone who hadn't been there sounded like when they tried to describe it. He knew the pauses in the wrong places, the generalizations where specifics should be, the fluency about facts that were publicly available, and the sudden vagueness around details that only experience would supply. He had heard it before over the decades, at VFW halls, at Memorial Day events, at dinners where someone a little too eager to impress had borrowed a history that wasn't theirs. He had never said anything before. He was not a confrontational man. He didn't believe in scenes. He had watched men die for principles far more important than his own comfort, and had concluded somewhere along the way that principles, to mean anything, had to be selective. You didn't spend them on every offence, you kept them for the things that mattered. But there was something specific about today, something about the 4th of July, with the flags in the yards and the smell of charcoal and the kids running between the tables, that made the particular lie Gary Polkow was telling feel like something different from a social exaggeration. It felt like a theft, not of valour from some abstraction called the military, but from specific men with specific names who had stood on a specific hill in January of 1968 and done something that Gary Polkow had never done and never would. Raymond finished the last of his paper cup of lemonade. He set the cup down in the grass near his lawn chair. He thought about the 8 men in the photograph, and then he walked back across the yard. He arrived back in the conversation to find that it had evolved in his brief absence. Gary had apparently taken the 2-minute pause as an opportunity to shore up his position. He was talking again, the ease re-emerging, the gestures returning, a story about a specific firefight that had the quality of something that had been field-tested over many years. Came out of nowhere, must have been 200 of them. We held for 6 hours, just the 12 of us. Raymond stood at the edge of the circle and listened. He let the story run another 30 seconds. He noted the specifics that were specific and the details that were borrowed, and the moments where the rhythm of the telling was too smooth. Polished by repetition into a shape that no actual memory has, because actual memories are jagged and inconsistent and full of the wrong details being the vivid ones. Then Gary said, "I lost 3 men that night. Good men." He said it quietly, with weight, with the practiced gravity of someone who has learned that this sentence specifically closes most conversations. It was a kind of armour, the mention of loss so definitive and so solemn that to question it felt like desecration. Raymond looked at him. "What were their names?" he said. The yard was not quiet yet. There was still music from Dave's speaker, still kids, still the smell of charcoal and lighter fluid, and the particular sweetness of whatever Carol was using as a glaze on the ribs. The world was still making its ordinary noise, but something had changed in the small air pocket of the conversation. Gary looked at Raymond with something behind his eyes that Raymond recognized, not immediately but within a half-second, as a specific kind of shame. Not the shame of someone who's been caught, the shame of someone who has just realized they are going to be caught. "It was a long time ago," Gary said. "It was," Raymond agreed. "But you remember the hill. You remember the rockets. You remember the 63 days, he held Gary's eyes. "You must remember their names." A child shrieked with laughter somewhere across the yard. Winston the beagle barked once, twice, then subsided. The circle was quiet. Dave Henderson, standing at the back, looked at Carol. Carol had both hands wrapped around her plastic cup of lemonade and was watching her father with an expression he had rarely seen on her. Something between alarm and a kind of awe she hadn't known she was capable of feeling for a 79-year-old man with a cane and a paper plate. Gary said nothing, and Raymond Kowalski took one quiet breath and said, "Then let me tell you about some names." What happened next would be talked about on Millbrook Avenue for the rest of the summer. There was a man named Arthur Delaney who had not planned to attend this barbecue. He lived 3 houses down, a compact white-haired man of 81 who had been a corpsman with the 26th Marine Regiment at Khe Sanh from January through March of 1968, and who had, in the 56 years since, attended every 4th of July event in the neighbourhood with the punctuality of a man who takes commitments seriously, and then suddenly, this year, had told his wife Shirley he didn't think he'd go. She had looked at him over her coffee cup. He had looked back at her. They had been married 53 years and communicated a great deal without speaking. "I'll bring the potato salad," she had said, which was how Arthur Delaney came to be walking through the side gate of the Henderson yard at 1:47 in the afternoon, carrying a large covered bowl, while his wife rang the doorbell at the front to let Carol know they'd arrived. Arthur stopped just inside the gate. He scanned the yard the way he had learned to scan every space he entered in January 1968, and had never quite unlearned, looking for the thing that was wrong, the arrangement of people that didn't match the expected pattern of a party. He found it almost immediately, a cluster of people near the folding tables standing too still for a barbecue watching something. He set the potato salad on the nearest table. He walked toward the group. He was halfway there when he heard Raymond Kowalski say, clearly and without raising his voice, "Lance Corporal David McKinney, killed on Hill 881 South, February 5th, 1968. Arthur Delaney stopped walking. He knew that name. He knew it the way he knew his own hands, without effort, without retrieval. The name simply present in him like a piece of furniture that has always been there. David McKinney had been 20 years old from Decatur, Illinois, and had been the first Marine Arthur Delaney had worked on at Khe Sanh who he had not been able to save. He had held that knowledge for 56 years. He moved forward into the circle without anyone making room for him, because he was the kind of man who didn't need room made. He looked at the old man with the cane. He looked at the large man in the Semper Fi shirt. He understood, immediately and completely, what was happening, and he decided, without deliberating about it, what he was going to do. Raymond had not looked up when Arthur arrived. He was looking at Gary. He said the name the way you say something important, not loudly, not dramatically, just with the full weight of what it actually was. A name was a name. It was the only thing left when everything else was gone. Lance Corporal David McKinney, he said, 20 years old, Decatur, Illinois. Killed on Hill 881 South, February 5th, 1968, during a reinforcement operation for positions that had been under sustained fire for 11 days. Gary had not moved. He stood with his hands at his sides and his beer on the table behind him, untouched. PFC Thomas Garrett, Raymond continued, 19 years old, Macon, Georgia. Killed on the same hill the same day within 40 meters of McKinney. His mother wrote to his commanding officer for 3 years afterward. The CO answered every letter. The music from Dave's speaker was still playing. Something by Creedence Clearwater Revival. Distant and incongruent. The kids were still running somewhere. But in this circle, in this 10-foot radius of 4th of July afternoon, something had gone completely still. Corporal James Whitehead, Raymond said, 22, Indianapolis. He'd been at Khe Sanh since November. He survived the siege and was killed by a mortar around 4 days before the Marines were relieved. He paused. 4 days. He was not looking at Gary with contempt. He was not performing. He was not speaking to the crowd. He was speaking to the names, the way people speak in churches, not to the building, but to whatever the building represents. Gary Polko's face had done something complicated. The smoothness was entirely gone. What was left underneath was a man. Just a man. 55 years old, selling insurance in Waukesha, looking at something he had not expected to see. Not exposure. Something worse than exposure. He had expected anger, maybe. The kind of confrontation that could be dismissed afterward as an old man with a chip on his shoulder. He had not expected grief. Real, old, specific grief. Worn smooth by 56 years of being carried without complaint. That was something else entirely. That was something you couldn't argue with, couldn't reframe, couldn't outlast. Arthur Delaney, standing in the circle, did not speak. He stood with his hands at his sides and he looked at Raymond Kowalski, and his eyes were doing something that his face was working hard not to do. One of the men in the circle, the 35-year-old, the one with the careful attentiveness, had taken out his phone, not to record. He was looking something up. Across the circle, a woman named Janet Kroll, who lived on the corner and had taught 7th grade history for 28 years, had pressed one hand to her mouth. Carol Henderson, standing beside her husband, had tears running down her face and was not wiping them. Raymond said, Sergeant First Class Harold Ewan, 31 years old, San Francisco. His daughter was born 2 weeks before he deployed. He had a photograph of her that he kept in his breast pocket. It was recovered with his effects. He stopped. He was quiet for a moment, not for drama, but because some names require a moment after them, just for the weight to settle properly. He never met her. The music had stopped. Dave had crossed to the speaker and turned it off without explaining why. Gary Polko's mouth opened slightly. Nothing came out. There are more, Raymond said. There are many more, but those are the ones I know personally. The ones I looked for when we came off the hills and found out what had happened. The ones whose names I could have told you in 1968, in 1988, this morning over breakfast. His voice did not waver. It was not the voice of a man on the edge of something. It was the voice of a man who had long since crossed that edge and come out the other side of it into something harder and quieter and more permanent. When you lose 3 men, as you said you did, you remember their names. The silence on Millbrook Avenue was the kind you hear maybe once or twice in a lifetime. And then Arthur Delaney spoke. What he said next would change the character of everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes, and confirm something that none of the bystanders, not even Carol, had known until this moment. Arthur's voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who spoke rarely, and meant everything he said. I was there, he said. He said it quietly. He said it to no one specific and to everyone. He said it the way you state a fact that requires no support, that needs no context because it is its own context. The circle turned to look at him. He didn't acknowledge the attention. He was looking at Raymond. I was a corpsman with the 26th Marines, he said. 3 houses down. He nodded briefly in the direction of his house. I've lived here 31 years. My wife makes excellent potato salad. He glanced at the table where the bowl still sat, covered. David McKinney was the first Marine I couldn't save. I've carried that since February 5th, 1968. I will carry it until the day I die. He looked at Gary. I don't know you, he said. Gary Polkow looked at him. His face had gone to a colour that had no polite name. I don't know this man, Arthur said again, not to Gary but to the circle. Not an accusation, a statement of fact delivered with the same flat precision as a medical assessment. I was on that base for 3 months. I knew the Force Recon men who came through. I knew men from 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. I don't know him. He turned back to Raymond. Something passed between the two of them. Something that had no name in English and possibly no name in any language. Something that was purely between men who have held certain things for certain lengths of time. I don't know who he is, Arthur said to Raymond, but I know who you are. Raymond looked at him. Raymond Kowalski, Arthur said. MACVSOG. You ran recon in the hills west of the base. We got your radio traffic on nights when the NVA was moving. Your team called in fire support at least twice that I can recall. He paused. Nobody on the base knew your names. We knew your call signs. But afterward, he stopped, looked at the grass for a moment. Afterward, when some of your team's actions were written up, I read the reports. I've had 50 years to make the connection. Raymond looked at the old corpsman for a long moment. Doc, he said. He said the word the way soldiers say it. Not a title, a name. Arthur Delaney's jaw moved once. He pressed his lips together. He nodded. Around them, 30 people stood in varying states of shock and understanding. The 35-year-old had looked up from his phone. He was standing completely still. On the screen, Raymond saw, though the distance was too great to make out the text, search results, a name, a citation. He ran 12 reconnaissance missions during the siege, Arthur Delaney said. Not performing this information, not presenting it for effect, simply saying it, the way you say something that deserves to be said in its complete form. 12 missions, behind enemy lines, in terrain the NVA controlled. His team operated for weeks at a time without resupply. They provided intelligence on troop movements that directly informed fire support decisions that saved Marine lives. He looked at Gary Polkow. That is why I know the name Raymond Kowalski. That is why any man who was actually at Khe Sanh would know the name. Ed Marchetti, standing with his arms crossed, had the expression of a man who has just learned that his entire understanding of a situation was wrong. Dave Henderson was looking at his father-in-law with something on his face that Raymond had not put there, and had not asked for and did not know what to do with, which was the look of a man realizing for the first time that he had been living alongside, eating dinner with, helping move furniture, watching football beside, someone whose life contained something so large and so significant that it simply had not fit inside the ordinary days they'd spent together. Raymond said nothing. He stood with his cane and waited. Arthur continued, not stopping, not looking at Raymond, at Gary. He received the Silver Star for an action in February 1968. He received the Bronze Star with Valour for a separate action in March. He was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross by his commanding officer, a recommendation that was downgraded twice through channels for reasons that were never fully explained and that were re-evaluated in 2007, resulting in a formal letter of recognition from the Department of the Army. He paused. I read that citation too. The 35-year-old with the phone, his name was Marcus Webb, and he would later post about what he witnessed here on a veterans forum with 14,000 members, had pulled up a page. He looked up from it. He looked at Raymond. He looked back at the page. He said quietly, to nobody in particular, "It's all here." Carol had stopped trying to wipe the tears. She was just standing with them on her face. Raymond looked at her. His expression was the same as it had always been. The stillness, the control, the level chin. But something in his eyes had shifted by a fraction of a degree. Something that was visible only if you were looking for it. Only if you were standing close enough and knew enough about what faces do when they carry something long enough that putting it down feels like losing a limb. He had not expected this. He had not come across the yard expecting Arthur Delaney. He had not planned the names, not rehearsed them, not calculated where this would go. He had done it because it needed to be done, in the same way he had done 12 other things in his life that needed doing regardless of where they led. He had not expected to be seen. He turned back to Gary. Gary Polkow was looking at the grass. Raymond said, "I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself. You're old enough to know better, and you know that too." He kept his voice level. No contempt in it, no anger. Just the flat clarity of a man who says exactly what he means. Those men I named, McKinney, Garrett, Whitehead, Ewan, they can't speak for themselves. That's the only reason any of this matters. Not my record, not yours, theirs. He picked up his cane from where he'd let it rest against the table. "Happy 4th of July," he said. He turned and walked back across the yard, and behind him, as he moved away from the circle and back toward the lawn chair where his plate still sat, and the flag still moved in the July breeze, an absolute and total silence followed him like a third shadow, a silence that people would still be talking about when the September leaves came down on Millbrook Avenue, when the holiday decorations were long packed away and the ordinary days had reasserted themselves, and someone would mention the 4th of July, and someone else would say, "Did I ever tell you what happened at the Hendersons?" And then the story would begin again, the way true things do. Gary Polkow stood in the circle for approximately 45 seconds after Raymond walked away. He looked at Arthur Delaney. Arthur looked back at him with the expression of a man who has seen too much to be angry about small things, but who is currently very tired. Gary reached out and picked up his beer can. He looked at it. He set it back down. He walked across the yard in the direction of the side gate and left. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said anything to him as he went. The silence that Raymond had left behind was a specific kind of silence. Not hostile, not triumphant, not even particularly dramatic. It was the silence of people in the presence of something they needed a moment to understand before they could make any sound at all. Janet Kroll, who had taught 7th grade history for 28 years, sat down in a folding chair and took a breath that sounded like someone surfacing from deep water. Marcus Webb was still looking at his phone. He turned it around and showed it to the man next to him. The man looked at the screen. He read for a moment. He looked up in the direction Raymond had gone. "Jesus," he said, quietly, to himself. Arthur Delaney turned and walked to the table where his potato salad still sat covered. He lifted the lid. He checked it. He put the lid back. He picked up a plastic fork from the utensil tray, sat down in the nearest lawn chair, and stared at the yard with the expression of a man who has just done something he'd needed to do for a very long time without knowing he needed to. Dave Henderson crossed the yard to his father-in-law. Raymond was sitting in his lawn chair. He had retrieved his paper plate, which had gone slightly cold. He was eating his hot dog. Dave stood next to him for a moment, not saying anything. "You can say it," Raymond said without looking up. "I don't know what to say," Dave admitted. "That's the correct response." Raymond took a bite, chewed, swallowed. "The hot dog is good." Dave sat down in the lawn chair next to him. He put his elbows on his knees and looked out at the yard where people were gradually beginning to come back to themselves. Small conversations resuming, someone getting a drink from the cooler, the beagle appearing from somewhere and being fed a piece of bratwurst by someone who wasn't supposed to. Normal life reasserting itself, the way it always does because it has no choice. "Did you know?" Dave said. "About him? About Delaney?" "No," Raymond said. "He knew about you." "Apparently." Raymond was quiet for a moment. He was a corpsman. They remember things. That's what they do. He set the plate on his knee and looked at the flags on the fence. "Good men, corpsman." Carol appeared from across the yard and came directly to her father and stood in front of him, and he looked up at her, and whatever she was about to say she didn't say because her face did it for her. He reached out and put one hand briefly on hers. "I'm fine," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not why I'm—" She stopped. "I know," he said. They sat in the July afternoon, the three of them, while the 4th of July went back to being the 4th of July around them. Across the yard, Raymond saw Arthur Delaney eating his potato salad with a plastic fork. At a certain point, the old corpsman looked up and found Raymond looking at him. They regarded each other across the distance of a backyard and 56 years. Arthur raised his plastic fork. Raymond raised his paper cup. What Carol did not know, what she would not know until 3 weeks later, when a letter arrived at the house on Millbrook Avenue, and she called her father to tell him about it, was that what had happened in that backyard was not over, that it had set something in motion that had been still for decades, that the world, in its slow way, was about to do something about the name Raymond Kowalski. The hours after the confrontation settled onto Millbrook Avenue the way summer afternoons settle, slowly, with weight, the light going golden and long across the yards and the conversations becoming quieter and more considered. in that way conversations get when people have witnessed something they're still processing. Gary Polkow did not return. His car, a silver Chevy Equinox which had been visible from the driveway, was gone within 4 minutes of his departure. Nobody mentioned this out loud. Nobody needed to. What people did instead was talk to Raymond. Not right away. Not in a rush. They came to him one at a time over the next 2 hours with the careful approach of people who aren't sure what they're going to say but know they need to say something. Ed Marchetti came first, sat down without invitation and said, "I was in Korea, 52 and 53. I never talked about it either." Raymond looked at him. Ed nodded. They sat together for a while. No further explanation was offered or required. A man named Steve Cho, who taught at the community college in Waukesha, came over with 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to Raymond and said, "My grandfather was in the Korean War. He never said a word about it his whole life." Raymond said, "A lot of them didn't." Steve said, "I think I'm starting to understand why." He went back to the party. Raymond drank his lemonade. Marcus Webb lingered longest. He was a software engineer with no military connection who had simply happened to be at this particular barbecue on this particular afternoon. He sat beside Raymond and said, eventually, "I've read a lot about Vietnam. I've read a lot about Khe Sanh. I had no idea." He stopped, restarted. "I had no idea people like you were there, doing what you described." "Most people don't," Raymond said. "Does that bother you?" Raymond considered this with genuine care. "It used to," he said. "Less so now." He looked at the young man. "The not knowing isn't the problem. The not caring is a problem. But you're here." So, Marcus Webb went home that evening and spent 3 hours on a veterans history forum posting a detailed account of what he had witnessed, including the names of McKinney, Garrett, Whitehead, and Ewan, and a link to Raymond Kowalski's unit history that Marcus himself had found and read in its entirety. By midnight, the post had 200 replies. By the following morning, it had been shared to 7 different veterans groups, 3 history forums, and a Facebook page dedicated to the 26th Marines that Arthur Delaney's own son ran. Arthur Delaney, 3 houses down, knew nothing about this. He was asleep in his chair in the living room by 9 o'clock, his wife's hand resting on his forearm, his face in sleep holding something that in waking he had long since learned to conceal. Raymond Kowalski drove home to Menominee Falls with Carol and Dave sitting in the back seat with the July fields going dark outside the window. Carol kept looking at him in the rearview mirror. He pretended not to notice. What Carol did not know, what she would not know until 3 weeks later, when a letter arrived at the house on Millbrook Avenue, was that what had happened in that backyard had set something in motion that had been still for a very long time. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived. It came addressed to Raymond Kowalski, in care of the Henderson address on Millbrook Avenue, which was the only address Marcus Webb had been able to locate in his online research. Carol brought it to her father at his house in Menominee Falls on a Sunday, setting it on his kitchen table while he made coffee, and stood waiting while he read it. He read it twice. He set it on the table. He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down. "What does it say?" Carol asked. "A veterans history organisation. They want to do an oral history interview." He wrapped both hands around his mug. They found the post from the party. Carol sat down across from him. "Will you do it?" He was quiet for a long time. Out the kitchen window, the August yard was dry and still. A cardinal moved through the serviceberry bushes and was gone. "I'll think about it," he said. He did the interview 6 weeks later. It lasted 4 hours and was conducted by a historian from the University of Wisconsin who had spent 15 years documenting MACV SOG operations. The historian cried twice. Raymond handed him a box of tissues and did not comment. The interview was eventually incorporated into an archive used by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. A version of it was included in a documentary about long-range reconnaissance operations during the Vietnam War that aired in limited distribution the following year. Raymond did not watch it, but Marcus Webb watched it, and Ed Marchetti. And a man in Decatur, Illinois, named Brian McKinney, who was 63 years old and had never known the full story of his Uncle David's death, who had grown up with a framed photograph on a wall and a family silence around the Vietnam War that had never quite explained itself, who sat in his living room on a weekday evening watching a retired Green Beret name his Uncle David on a screen, specifically and clearly and with the care that a name deserves. Brian McKinney called his mother after the documentary ended. She was 86 and answered on the fourth ring. "Mum," he said, "did you know someone named Kowalski?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "but I know the name. There was a letter once, a long time ago." She paused. "I think your grandmother kept it." Arthur Delaney had his own conversation with his son that fall. Michael Delaney, who ran the 26th Marines Facebook page and had grown up with a father who did not talk about Vietnam, called after seeing the Marcus Webb post shared in the group. "Dad," he said, "is this true? Were you there when this happened?" "At the barbecue," Arthur confirmed. "I was there. And the man, Kowalski, you actually knew who he was." "I knew who he was." A silence on the line, the kind that parents and children have when they're on the same side of something they have never discussed. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Michael said. "About any of it?" Arthur was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know how to start," he said. Gary Polkow was not part of any of this. He had gone back to Waukesha and did not appear at any further Millbrook Avenue events. The Semper Fi shirt was not seen again. Nobody looked for him, and nobody expected to see him, and if anyone on the street carried judgment toward him, they kept it private because the day had been about something larger than what Gary Polkow had done, and they knew it. Raymond Kowalski went back to his life in Menomonee Falls. He went to his Monday Senior Center Chess Club, which he had attended for 11 years, and beat a man named Frank Szymanski for the 14th consecutive time, and accepted the defeat of his opponent with the same grave courtesy he always did. He called Carol on Sundays. He read a great deal. He walked in the park when the knee allowed. He took out the photograph sometimes. 8 men in front of a roofless structure, squinting into white morning light. He looked at the 4 who were gone and the 4 who weren't, including himself, 24 years old, carrying 65 pounds of gear, unsmiling in the way soldiers are unsmiling in photographs because they have learned that the camera doesn't understand smiling in certain contexts. He still didn't think of it as a sad thing. He thought of it as a true thing. That was enough. There's a particular kind of courage that history makes room for. The loud kind, the visible kind, the kind with monuments and speeches and crowds. And then there's the kind Raymond Kowalski had. The kind that moves through triple canopy jungle for weeks at a time without anyone knowing your name, that carries 4 specific names for 56 years without needing acknowledgement, that walks across a backyard on a 4th of July afternoon, not to make a scene, but because the names deserve it. He would have gone home that day whether Arthur Delaney appeared or not, whether anyone posted anything or not, whether anyone changed their mind about anything or not. He had walked across that yard because it was the right thing to do, and he would have walked back in the same quiet he'd arrived in, if the world had simply let him. That's what most of it looks like. Most of the courage, most of the service. Not the moment anyone witnesses, but the 56 years of ordinary days before and after it, carrying something heavy and true without asking anyone to carry it with you. Raymond Kowalski sat in his lawn chair on the 4th of July, holding a paper plate with a half-eaten hot dog, watching the flags in the yards of people who would never know his name. That was enough. That was more than enough. If this story moved you, if you believe the men who carry the names deserve to have their own name remembered, subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories every week because they deserve to be told, and because the people who lived them deserve more than silence. Ring the bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. For Raymond, for Arthur, for David McKinney, Thomas Garrett, James Whitehead, and Harold Ewan, and for everyone who knows their name.